I guess you all are aware that Halloween is coming up on Wednesday evenings while we canceled all of our activities, and we're going to have a trunk or treat out in the parking lot. We had over 1,000 people that came through our parking lot last year, and we anticipate there'll probably be even more this year. But have you ever wondered where in the world this whole idea of Halloween came from? I kind of asked myself that question this week, and I did a little research on that, and it really goes back a long time ago. It goes back to the British Isles and the Celts, before Christianity really had an effect upon their life. The Celts had this belief that the year was divided into two parts. You had the light half year when the daylight was longer, and then you had a half dark year when the daylight hours were fewer. And they believed that when the light year began to end and the dark year began, in that brief amount of time, which we would call Halloween or the evening before, they believed that the spirits of the dead became active and they began to interact with people. Only time of the year that they would do that. And they celebrated the spirits of the dead kind of coming back and visiting them. It was also a time that they kind of celebrated the harvest and fruitfulness, and all these were kind of thrown into a celebration that they called Samhain. Now, Samhain had been deeply entrenched in the Celts, and when Christianity came, they really tried to stamp it out, but they were unsuccessful. And so what Christians often did in times like that, they just Christianize a pagan celebration, kind of like our Christmas tree that we use today, kind of came from pagan Germany. And so they called that evening All Hallows Eve. And it was a day and the day that followed was All Saints Sunday. And on this occasion, they celebrated or venerated the saints who had gone before. And how they would do this celebration on Halloween, this is like in the year 800 AD, 1,200 years ago. The rich people would dress up, and they would go into the poor neighborhoods, and they would knock on doors, and when people come to the door, they would give them food in exchange that the poor people would pray for their deceased family members. So I guess that's where the concept of going door to door and say we do our trick-or-treating, but an exchange of food for something else. 1,200 years ago, they were doing things like that. In Mexico, surprisingly, there was kind of a similar type of observance that the Aztecs did before Christianity came to Mexico. And it was a day that they would also venerate the dead and sometimes display the heads of the victims of their warfare. The Aztecs were really into keeping skulls as trophies. And so they would drag these skulls out, and sometimes they'd wear them around their neck. And on this day, they would venerate the dead and also sort of honor their victories in war. And they would dress up as skeletons, and they still do that today. But the church came into Spanish Christianity, also tried to stamp out this practice, and just couldn't do it. So they Christianized that. And today, this observance in Mexico is known as Dia de los Muertos, which is the Day of the Dead. And so you see in Mexico, people dressing up as skeletons on the street, and there are just skulls everywhere. So I guess in our own way, we've kind of adapted or adopted some of those practices from ancient Great Britain as well as Mexico. But we have Christianized it, so we call the evening before All Saints Sunday is All Hallows Eve. And then on Sunday that follows, we remember the dead, the saints who have gone before. They were so much a part of our life. And so since Halloween is coming up, I wanted to kind of talk about the saints this morning. And when you hear the word saint, and that's a word that can conjure up a lot of variety of images and meanings. A husband may be deeply embedded in his recliner, and he may turn to his wife and say, "Honey, would you be a saint and hand me the remote control so I won't have to get up out of my recliner?" Or, "Would you pass me that bag of potato chips and so I don't have to move? I'm right deeply here in my chair and I don't want to have to get up." Well, that's one we may think. We kind of use that flippantly or casually a little bit, but kind of when we think of saint, we think of really important Christians, I think, don't we? I remember my very first Bible that I received when I was in the 3rd grade, and the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, but in the Gospels were all referred to as the Gospel of St. Matthew, St. Mark, St. Luke, and St. John. I don't see that in Protestant Bibles today. I just see the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but not referring to them as Saint John or Saint Matthew, whatever. But that's kind of one of the first images I had of a saint, was somebody who was really important, like the apostles, the disciples of Jesus, significant religious figures. Mother Teresa has been recently sainted by the Catholic Church, venerated now as a saint, someone who showed great courage and sacrifice to dedicate her life living in the slums of India. You had St. Anselm and St. Augustine, great theologians, early church fathers that were sainted by the church. These people are extraordinary Christians who did amazing things that had a profound impact upon the Christian church today. And so we venerate them as saints. Great theologians, people who suffered greatly for their faith, and we bestow upon them that title of saint. But you know, biblically speaking, that's really not true. That's not the way it's supposed to be. Because in the New Testament, saint refers to all of the faithful Christians who live their life for Jesus Christ, and who, because of the way that they have lived their life, the churches exist today, where the church was so impacted by the quality of their faith that it affected the lives of other people around them. They are the true saints of the church, and who, because of their faithfulness, the church is here today. As I look back at some of my previous churches, there are some individuals that, in my mind, just sort of stand out as the saints of these churches. One was an elderly couple, actually a man and his wife that were in their mid-80s. And they were farmers, they were simple folks, and faithful members of the Bodark United Methodist Church. And their last name was Cotter, and they came to church faithfully Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. What was unusual about that was that Mr. Cotter had, well, he's pretty severely crippled, and he had braces on his arms and crutches. And it would just take him forever to kind of walk anywhere. So just for him to move around was kind of a struggle. But what really made him stand out in my mind was that, as many churches did back 100 years ago, they built a long flight of stairs to get up into the sanctuary. They didn't have a ramp. They didn't have a wheelchair ramp. They didn't have an elevator. So if Mr. Cotter and his wife were going to come to church, he had to climb about 12 steps every Sunday to get up. And it was hard for him to get up, but he never missed a Sunday. And I thought, what a testament of his faith that he would struggle so hard just to come and to worship. He wasn't a Sunday school teacher. He was not one of the leaders or elders of the church, but nobody could discount his extreme faithfulness to worship his God every Sunday. It would have been so easy for him. In fact, I think maybe the way they built churches back then is that we didn't expect crippled people to come to church. So we sure made it hard for them to come, but he made it every Sunday. Then another one of my churches, there was a man by the name of Jack, and Jack was adopted. His parents, his biological parents, gave him up for adoption somehow, didn't want to raise him, and so a nice couple in the Hood United Methodist Church adopted Jack, and they were such a wonderful couple, and they loved him just as he was their own son. And he was so appreciative of the fact that his adopted mother and father loved him, and they exposed him to Christianity and growing up in the church. He grew up on a dairy farm, but he and his father decided to leave the dairy business, and they bought an old truck, and they filled it up with gravel, and they would drive that truck to where they were building highways. And they would dump their gravel, and they'd go back, and they'd get another load. And, they did pretty well at this, and they began to buy other trucks. And then pretty soon they created their own highway construction business, Masters and Jackson Construction. And they built all the major highways going into and out of Springfield, Missouri. And he made a lot of money. And he was the most generous member of all the churches that I've ever pastored. He made a lot. He gave a lot of money. And he loved giving money. He also gave substantially to the Good Samaritan Boys Home. So he had been so touched by their love and how they treat boys who are orphans like he was at one time. He just wanted to give and support them. But Jack was a really humble and simple kind of guy, not very articulate. He had really kind of difficulty expressing himself in a clear and cohesive way, but boy, was his heart good. And there was just no one as generous as Jack. And he was generous out of appreciation, that he believed that God had blessed him with his adoptive parents, had rescued him from a life that could have gone very much the other way. And he was very appreciative. Another church I pastored, there's a man by the name, we called him Hino Head Sr. Hino Head stands for Henry O. Head. And he and his wife were from Mississippi. He had a long southern drawl. And Hino was known as Mr. Evangelist in the town of Monette. He was, he talked about Jesus Christ to everybody, I guess you'd say, but he did it in a very non-offensive way. He had an engaging smile and a chuckle and a warm sense of humor. But if you spent much time with Hino, at some point in time, we're going to talk about Jesus Christ in that conversation. He started a camp called Camp Soaring Hawk that was a Christian camp. And kids from all over the South and the Midwest would come to his camp, and they would hear about Jesus Christ in a very deliberate and intentional kind of way. He eventually retired, and he sold that camp to Camp Kanakuk, and it became a camp for terminally ill children who are in the midst of some treatments, and were really very much weakened as an opportunity to kind of give them joy in their life. On the day that they made their last worship service at the Monette Church, the church I had pastored for a while, and we had bought 71 acres of land about a mile away to build a new Methodist church. And the congregation asked Hino Head if he would speak to the congregation on the steps of that old church that they were leaving. And he recounted all of what God had done in the life of that particular building. The baptisms, the professions of faith, the weddings and the funerals, the Sunday school classes, the Meals on Wheels program that came out of that church, and so many ministries. And then he led the congregation. He's in his 80s now, and he led the congregation by foot. They walked a mile to their brand new church. And then somebody else kind of preached the first sermon in that new church. But he was just venerated by that church. Everybody respected Hino. I don't know if I ever heard a negative comment in the 10 years that I was there about Hino Head. You know, this church has its own saints. There are people here who will be long remembered for the contributions that they made to this congregation that strengthened it and sustained it and made it such a great place for people to be. Every time I step foot in this sanctuary, I'm aware of the fact that the saints of this church who decided to build this sanctuary in 1929, who began construction, and then you had the collapse of the economy and the Great Depression, but who paid off this building in 7 years, I believe, during the midst of the worst economic time in our nation's history. A building that cost $65,000 then, but would be equivalent to $3 million today. I think that is pretty amazing that they could pay for that building in the midst of the Great Depression. What a story that is. The church exists because of the saints who have gone before us, who made the powerful influence and impact in people's lives, and who by their own example have inspired other people to be good and faithful and hardworking Christian people. I want to go back now to that passage that we read from 1 Corinthians, and to remind you that the Apostle Paul, we might call him St. Paul this morning, Paul wrote 1 Corinthians to correct some problems that were taking place in the church. Corinth was an amazingly spiritually gifted church, but it was also a spiritually immature church. They hadn't been Christians very long. There were 5 major problems that were going on in this church as he wrote this letter. And those problems were spiritual pride. Some people believed that their spiritual gifts were better than other people, and they kind of lorded it over those other people. There was a problem with communion and who came to the communion table and how much food people could eat at the communion table, and they favored the rich over the poor. He was very upset about that. The church was divided by factions, people who were looking out for their own personal interests, not the interests of the greater good of the church. There were people who had problems with sexual immorality, and he talks about that. And also there's some misunderstandings of the resurrection. And Paul wrote that great 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians, the longest discourse on the resurrection in the entire Bible, really theologically grounds it. So it's very helpful for us who live today, our understanding coming out of his experience and the experience of the disciples who had witnessed the risen Christ. It's a great chapter. But I want to go back and talk about one problem that he had particularly, and that was the deference to the rich. Christianity started out with the lower classes, and eventually, as it got more established, it attracted people of money. And people of wealth who came into the church were looked upon more favorably than the poor who had formerly made up the church. They thought that because they were rich, they must be somehow better or special. And they were so impressive that the rich people would come that they really gave them favored treatment. Now, Paul's going to try to correct this. He really doesn't like the fact that one group of people are being treated differently or better than another. And so he writes this. Now, if you kind of read between the lines, say this is dripping with sarcasm. So listen in that vein. Already you have all you want. Already you've become rich. You've become kings, and that without us. How I wish that you really had become kings, so that we might be kings with you. For it seems that God has put us apostles on display at the end of the procession, like men condemned to die in the arena. We have been made a spectacle to the whole universe, to angels as well as to men. We are fools for Christ. We are weak, but you're strong. You are honored, but we are dishonored. Now, Paul's painting an image. When the Victorian Roman army would march their troops back into the city of Rome, at the end of the glorious procession, they would bring the captives who would have been shackled, maybe stripped, beaten, bloodied. People would throw things at them and jeer at them and hurl insults at these captives of the Roman army. And Paul says, you're treating me and the other apostles like that. Like men condemned to die, to take them in their bloody state and throw them into the arena where the healthy gladiators will just cut them to pieces. That's how he was feeling. That the Corinthian congregation was looking upon him who had brought the gospel to them in a way of disrespect. And so he says, we have become the scum of the earth, the refuse of the world. Wow. St. Paul saying, that's how you make me feel. If you were the recipient of that letter, that might shame you, wouldn't it? To have the greatest evangelist in Christianity say, this is how you have made me feel. Now, the Apostle Paul was not advocating what had happened to him with beatings and imprisonment and poverty and humiliation. But he was advocating this, and this is important for us to hear this morning. He was advocating putting their faith on the line. If you really want to be a disciple of the Lord Jesus Christ, sometimes you got to stick your neck out for Jesus. And you have to be willing to be thought of badly for the sake of the gospel. If you really want to serve me, you might be rejected, and you might be humiliated, and you might be scorned. But he's also saying that the church could not and would not advance with arrogant, self-righteous, and unengaged Christians. If that's what Christianity was becoming, it would never succeed. To follow Jesus, you've got to get your hands dirty. It's not a tea party, the business we are in, because we're in the most important business of all, of changing people's lives by introducing them to Jesus Christ, who can transform any and every life. I think we have a picture, Tristan, of a Christian saint. I wanted to show this individual, and if we can get his picture up there. He was a Catholic priest. Yeah, his name is Father Damien. Father Damien became a priest in Hawaii, and 9 years after he became a priest, he went to his bishop and asked for a most unusual assignment. He asked if he could go to the island of Molokai and be a priest at the leper colony. Now, you know, lepers, people feared leprosy. It was a horrible, disfiguring disease, and it ultimately was fatal. And when someone contracted leprosy, they were taken away from their family, away from their community, away from their friends, and they were banished someplace. People wouldn't have to look at them, and they would end their days in kind of a horrible state of life and suffering. Nobody to look after them, nobody to care for them. And Father Damien said, that's where I want to go. I want to be their priest. If you look at that picture where he's wearing the hat, this is after he contracted leprosy. And you can see that one ear is disfigured, that his face has been kind of distorted by the disease. His hands, if you look at his hands, are knobby and don't look normal. He died of leprosy, being a priest to the lepers. And just a few years ago, the Roman Catholic Church sainted him for his courage, for his sacrifice, for the great faith that he would volunteer to go someplace that everybody else wanted to avoid as much as possible. There is a saint of the Lord. I met a saint one time on the Interstate 44. I was filling my car up with gasoline, and a young black man pulled up next to me at the pump and started filling his car up. And his car was piled high with suitcases and boxes, and his license plate was from Michigan. And I said, "You look like you're going somewhere, like you're moving." He said, "Yeah, I am." He said, I'm a minister, and I'm going to Los Angeles." "Oh, yeah, what are you going to do in Los Angeles?" He said, "Well, I'm going to start a mission outpost on the boundary between the Crips and the Bloods street gangs in Los Angeles. I'm going to start a church for those people." That was at least 20 to 25 years ago. They were notorious for drive-by shootings. They had a spike in the murder rate in Los Angeles. They would just go by and kill each other, sometimes getting innocent people on the street caught up in their shooting. And he was leaving the comforts of his home to go start a ministry with the most violent gangs in Los Angeles. I don't know what happened to him, if he was successful or not, but I thought, you're a real saint, that you would voluntarily put yourself in a place like that. Wow, that's really amazing. Saints are people who go before us, who pave the way, and who, because of their great faith, make a difference in people's lives, and why the church exists today. In our Methodist tradition, on the first Sunday of the new year, we have a covenant service, oftentimes have a covenant service, and in that covenant service there's a prayer. And Tristan, I'd like for you to put that prayer up there now. And it's called Wesley's Covenant Prayer. Hopefully you get it up there on the screen. It's not up there? Okay. Then I'm going to say this prayer slowly. And I want you to think about what I'm saying, and if you want it to apply to you. And it goes like this. Lord, make me what you will. I put myself fully into your hands. Put me to doing, put me to suffering. Let me be employed for you or laid aside for you. Let me be full. Let me be empty. Let me have all things. Let me have nothing. I freely and with a willing heart give it all to your pleasure and disposal. If you feel that way, what I'd like for you to do, and I'm going to change what Kevin said, is to take a look at this ministry list again. And what we're asking you to do is to try to decide where you would like to serve Jesus Christ this next year. And we've got some suggestions down there. let me tell you, since we put this out here, I've had a young man new to our church who's come forward and said, you know, I think I would like to start a substance abuse program for people with drug addictions. Wow. That's something we haven't had, but something that we need. Judy Bentley in our church is now guiding the widowed persons support group that meets on Monday. That was her passion. She wanted to reach out to people who had lost a spouse and were grieving the loss of that spouse. We started to meet back in the summer, and then when the fall game came, I turned that over to Judy, and she's doubled the attendance, and she's taken it on. They meet every Monday, have about a dozen men and women who come, and they support each other in their grief and loss. What a great thing. I've got a couple of other of our church members who have come forward and say, you know, I think I would like to teach that English as second language to people of Spanish background here in West Plains. It's a ministry we haven't had, but I think we're going to have. And these are people who are carving out a new ministry and mission of our church that hasn't existed before. That say, you know, I think I could do that because I would like to do that. You know, everybody needs to be using their gifts and their skills that God has given them in some way. And if we don't have an area that you're interested in, then we're asking you then to come forward and say, you know, have you ever thought about this? I think I would like to do that. In fact, I think God is leading me to do something like that. And we think that when we unleash all of you to do the ministry that God wants you to do, that we're going to have an amazing impact in this town. We're going to touch people's lives for the purpose of bringing them here and introducing them to the Lord Jesus Christ so they can become Lord of their lives like he is Lord of our life. So what I want you to do today, I want you to act on this. If there's an area that you're interested in, sign your name and circle the area or areas that you're interested in. And if the area that you're interested in is not mentioned here, but you have a burning passion to do something, write it down. But if you don't know what you want to do right now, sign your name and turn it in, because then we know that you're waiting for the right opportunity and your heart is in the right place and you will do something. Maybe you don't know quite sure what it is now, but you know what it is. And what I would like for you to do, instead of waiting until the end of the service when you're leaving the sanctuary, as the band plays the closing song, I'd like for you to get up out of your pew and come down here and put your pledge right in here. A pledge of service. You know, we have a covenant relationship in the Methodist Church. We covenant of membership as I will be a faithful member of the United Methodist Church by my prayers, my presence, my gifts, my service, and my witness. And then the church covenants with you that we will try to have the very best church to offer you that we know how to have. So it's a covenant. If you're ready to make that covenant with God to be his servant and to serve the Lord Jesus Christ, then get up out of your seats as the band is singing and come down and put that piece of paper in that basket. Now I'm